This is Practical 1 Study Guide Review Part 3. Here we're going to be talking about the body. This is in your study guide. So the screen here is just sharing the study guide. So let's keep going and go through this. Okay, levels of organization. Levels of organization is talking about how you can go from the simplest to the most complex. So the simplest part of the body would be down here in the lower left-hand side. This is going to be, I'll write a number 1 on it. This is going to be our atoms. So our atoms is the simplest portion or simplest level of organization in our body. And a bunch of these atoms in number 1 combined, and they form number 2, which is a complex protein molecule. Then a bunch of number 2 or protein molecules get together and they'll form filaments. Then a bunch of these protein filaments get together here from picture number 3 and form a cell. There are a bunch of different types of cells in the body. But again, going down from the bottom, the simplest level of organization is an atom. Your atoms get together, so a bunch of these from number 1 get together and form number 2, which is a complex molecule. Then a bunch of number 2s get together to form number 3, which is a protein filament. Then a bunch of these filaments get together and they form number 4, which is the cellular level. So if you'll see here, all of number 1, 2, and 3 is called the molecular level. So the chemical and molecular level. Then it will go up to a cellular level. So all of these 1, 2, and 3 can be combined into one level called your chemical or molecular level. So this would be the big number 1, or the first level of organization right here. Then this one would be number 2, the second level or large level of organization right here. Okay. So now I'm going to erase all this and we will continue to the next levels. Okay. So we're going to go down to the next page. So we've done the cellular level. Now a bunch of cells get together and they form a tissue. Okay. So right here would be your tissue layer or tissue level. Then a bunch of tissues get together and they combine to form the organ level. And that's what you see right here, the organ level. Then a bunch of different organs get together and they form an organ system. And then a bunch of different organ systems get together to form the complete organism. Okay, so let's go review all of those again. Whoops, let me get my eraser here. And we're going to review each of those and then we'll talk about them some more in a little bit more detail. So going back up to the first page. Again, this is the levels of organization in the body. So the first level here would be your chemical and molecular level. And that goes all the way from atoms through to the molecules and then on to the filaments. The second level of organization here is the cellular level. A bunch of these cells from the cellular level get together. And when a bunch of those cells get together, they form the tissue level, because tissues are just a bunch of cells that have gotten together. Then once a bunch of these tissues get together, then it will go up to an organ level, because an organ is made up of several different types of tissues. Then from the organ level, you will go up to the organ system level, and that's where a bunch of different organisms are going to work together with one overall function, and that forms an organ system. So an example of an organ system would be your digestive system. A bunch of the organs that make up that digestive system would be your esophagus, stomach, intestines, liver. So the organ level would be each of those individual organs. And when all those stomach, esophagus, intestines, livers all get together, then it forms the organ system. Then the digestive system, plus the respiratory system, plus the circulatory system, plus every other system in the body will get together and form a complete organism. You need to be able to recognize these pictures and tell me what level of organization we're showing you, okay? So if you see this picture here, grab my pen again. If you see a picture that looks like this right here that I'm circling, you need to be able to tell me that that level of organization is the tissue level. If you're seeing a complete picture like this one, you need to be able to tell me that this level of organization is the organism level. Okay, moving on. Now, directional terminology. So in medicine or in the medical field, we use directional terminology. So we're not going to be saying front or back or top and bottom, okay? So these directional terminologies take the place of those generic terms. So let's look at the picture in the left-hand side here. You have cranial. Cranial means towards the head, and caudal. Caudal means towards the tail. Then you have anterior or ventral. Anterior or ventral means to the front, and posterior or dorsal means to the back. Then in the right-hand picture here, medial means towards the midline of the body. So let me grab my pen again. So I'm going to draw a line down the middle of the body. That would be the midline of the body. So everything towards that red line, towards the middle of the body, would be called medial. And everything away from that medial line is called lateral. So your belly button is medial. Your elbow is lateral. Okay, so your belly button is medial because it's on that midline or close to that midline. And your elbows are lateral because they're far away or going away from the midline. Okay, then we have proximal and distal. Proximal and distal are comparing 2 points on the same limb. In other words, they're comparing 2 points on the same arm, or they're comparing 2 points on the same leg. Proximal means the point closest to the point of attachment, and distal means a point farthest from the point of attachment. So your shoulder is proximal, where your fingertips are distal. Okay. Then right in the middle of this picture here, you will see a term called superior and inferior. So superior means towards the top. So here's superior, towards the top, and inferior towards the bottom. So when we're looking at these pictures, your hip would be more superior to your toes, because your toes would be more inferior. Okay, your hip would be superior to the toes because it's more towards the top, and your toes would be more inferior because they're more towards the bottom. Okay, so let's do some practice here. And when you're doing the practice here, you're comparing 2 points. So looking at this picture here on the right, we would say, let me get my pen here. Oops. Get my pen. Okay. So we would say the breastbone or the sternum, here I'm writing in reds, that's where your chest plate, or sorry, your breastbone is, or your sternum, would be what to the belly button? I'm going to draw a red dot down here at the bottom where your belly button would be. Okay, so they're both medial, so you can't use medial because they're both just as medial as the other one. But our sternum here in the top would be more superior than our belly button, because remember, superior is towards the top, inferior is below. So we would say our sternum is superior to our belly button. But what if we flip that sentence around? What if we said, what is our belly button to our sternum? Well, now we're using our belly button first. So we're saying our belly button is inferior to our sternum because our belly button sits more towards the bottom. Okay, so let's go over both of those again. If we're saying, what is our sternum? Let me put, what is our sternum? This is number 1 to our belly button, which is number 2 here. Our sternum is superior to my belly button. But if we flip the sentence again, now we say my belly button is what to my sternum. So number 2 is what to number 1. My belly button, number 2, is inferior to my sternum, which is number 1, because it sits below. So whatever organ or body part you're putting at the beginning of the sentence, you're telling me where that one is, okay? So let's practice some more because I know this is confusing. Let me erase all my points here. Okay, now we're going to use 2 different points of the body to make another comparison. Okay, let me make my pen a little bit darker. Okay, so let's now use, let's see, let me use my nose right here. I'm drawing a number 1 on my nose. And let's use, no, let's not use, yeah, let's use a belly button again. So if I say my nose is what to my belly button, or number 1 is what to number 2. Number 1 would be superior to number 2. Or in other words, my nose is superior to my belly button. Now let's flip. Number 2 is what to number 1. Number 2 is inferior to number 1. Or my belly button is inferior to my nose. Now let's do another one. Let's see, let me see. Let's do the breast here. Number 3 is what to number 4. Number 3, the breast, is superior to the knee, number 4. So again, the breast, number 3, is superior to the knee, which is number 4. But if we flip that around, the knee, number 4, is inferior to number 3, which is the breast. So always remember, the body part you're mentioning first is where you're telling the direction or where you're giving the direction from. Okay, now let's do proximal and distal. So remember, proximal and distal, you're comparing 2 points on the same limb. So let me get my pen again. Okay, so let's say the hip here, number 1, is what to number 2, the knee. You're not going to use superior and inferior here. Instead, being you're comparing 2 points on the same limb, you're going to use proximal or distal. So number 1 would be proximal to number 2, or my hip would be proximal to my kneecap. Because remember, my hip is closer to the point of attachment. If I flip this sentence around and I say, what is number 2 to number 1? Number 2 would be distal to number 1, or my knee would be distal to my hip, because my knee is further away from the point of attachment. So it is more distal than my hip. Okay, now let's erase these. Now I'm going to give you one that's a little bit more confusing. Now that we've talked about proximal and distal, let's do this one right here. What is number 1 right here on my elbow? to number 2 down here at my knee. Okay, number 1 and number 2 are not on the same limbs, so we're not going to use proximal and distal. Instead, we're going to use superior and inferior. So number 1 would be superior to number 2. Or if I flipped that sentence around, number 2 would be inferior to number 1. Okay, now let's look on this picture in the, in the left picture. We're going to use posterior and anterior here. So the breast here, number 1, is it anterior or superior to the booty in number 2? The breast in number 1 would be anterior to the booty. Now let's flip that around. Number 2 would be what to number 1? Number 2 would be posterior to number 1, because your booty is towards the back and the breast is towards the front. So your booty would be more posterior and the breast would be more anterior. So number 2 is posterior to number 1. But realize here, I could have said number 2 is more dorsal than number 1, because remember, you can use either term here, posterior or dorsal. Or I even could have said on number 1 is ventral to number 2, because again, you can use anterior or ventral. I'm going to put an attachment into your Practical 1 Canvas shell down in Practical 1 module. I'm going to add a worksheet where you can practice these directional terms. Okay, let's do another one with medial and lateral. So looking at the picture in in the right-hand side, your nose is what to your ears? Your nose would be medial to your ears. Let's do another one. One that is not covered on here that you do need to know is deep and superficial. So deep means more towards the interior of the body, and superficial means more towards the exterior of the body. So your heart would be what to your skin? Your heart would be your heart would be deep, your skin would be superficial. So your heart would be deep to the skin. Flip that around. What would your skin be to your heart? Your skin would be superficial to your heart. So make sure you study these directional terminologies. And again, practice on that worksheet that I'm going to put in your Practical 1 module. Okay, I'm going to skip this page here because the next few pages after this page is going to take a little bit of it and blow it up. So I'm going to move from this smaller page here to the magnified images here. So you can see that's the same thing. It's the same information, but it takes just a portion of it and blows it up to where you can read it more legibly. Okay, these are called anatomical landmarks. So on a practical, if I ask you what this landmark is, you're going to be telling me these terms. But let's get one thing out of the way because they have the common name and the medical name for it. So for instance, I'm circling the frontal or forehead here. For A&P, you cannot put the forehead. It's just telling you what the frontal landmark name is used for. So in our A&P lab, if I point to the forehead, you're going to tell me it's the frontal. The same thing, for example, when I'm pointing to the nose, you're not going to tell me nose, you're going to tell me nasal. Okay, so anytime where you see there's two words here, you're going to use the first term. You're never going to use the common term. Okay, so let's go through all these together. Okay, the first one we're going to do here, let me get my pen again. is going to be cephalic. So cephalic is the name for this entire head and face. So the skull and the face, all of that together is grouped into a term called cephalic. So I would have to say, if you're talking about cephalic, I'd say, what is it? And I'd have to put a circle around it or put a big sticker on it and say, what is this entire landmark called? That entire landmark, for instance, if I put number 1, whoops, I don't know why my number 1 looks so bad. Sorry about that, guys. So if I say, what is number 1, the entire landmark number 1, you would tell me cephalic. Okay, the next one is within cephalic, you have 2 different large landmarks. You have the cranial. The cranial means the skull or the hard part of the bones. And then you have facial, which is your face. Going on from that, within the face and the cranial, you have the forehead here, which is called the frontal. You have the eye, which is called the ocular or the orbital. You can use either one on the practical. Your nose is called the nasal. So on the practical, you would tell me nasal. The cheeks is called your buccal or buccal. Again, make sure you don't put cheek, put buccal. The mouth is the oral. The chin is called the mental. And the neck, whether it's the front or the back, doesn't matter. Both the front and the back of the neck are called your cervical. Moving down from there, you have the thoracic. So the thoracic would be the entire chest area. So all of this would be your thoracic, okay? Within the thoracic, you have the mammary, which is the breast. Erase this. Okay, moving down from the thoracic and mammary, you're going to go down to the abdomen. So the abdomen is the stomach area. Going down from the abdomen, you then have the umbilical. The umbilical is your belly button. And if you'll see over to the right-hand side, all of this area, the abdominal, the umbilical, and the thoracic, so all of this that I'm circling in green, all of that together would be included in the trunk. So if I had number 1 here, and I said this entire landmark, number 1, is called the what? You would tell me it's called the trunk. Okay, now going down the arm on the left-hand side of this picture, the armpit is called the axillary. The top of the arm is called the brachial. The inside of the elbow is called the antecubital. Now let's move on to the next picture. So now we're going down the body. So the forearm here is called the antebrachial. The wrist is called the carpal. So if you've ever heard of carpal tunnel syndrome, that's a problem in the wrist area. The palm of the hand is called palmar. All of the fingers are called the digits or phalanges. I'll take either one of those terms, digits or phalanges. And the thumb is called the pollex. Now we talked about the umbilical is your belly button. So I'm going to draw a green dot. Your belly button would be right there. So underneath the belly button, this area right here that I'm drawing, kind of a square, that's called your pelvic. Then the diagonal line right here, where your lower limbs or your legs connect to the body, those diagonal lines right there, that's called your inguinal. So your inguinal would be the groin area. Again, that's where the 2 dividing lines or the 2 diagonal lines where your leg goes into the trunk. Okay, then you have the pubic. The pubic is going to be where your external genitalia is going to be located. So that would be right. Oops, sorry. Got to get my pen again. So here you're seeing all of the male external genitalia. So that right there would be the pubic. Okay. Now the hand over here on the right-hand side, you'll see that the entire hand, which is the palm or the palmar, the pollex, and the digits or phalanges, all of that would be called the manual. So if you do manual labor, it means you're using your hands. So here in our medical terminology, the entire hand would be called manual. Now going down to the leg here, the top portion of the leg that we call the thigh, that area is going to be the femoral. So you can see number 1 here would be the femoral. Number 2, right here, your kneecap, that would be your patellar. Here, oops, I should have drawn a 3 there, sorry. Number 3 is going to be your crural. You can think of your crural, the way to memorize that is that it's very cruel to kick somebody in the shin because it hurts so bad. So your crural is going to be your shin area. Your tarsal is number 4. That's going to be your ankle. Then you have all of your toes down here. Your little toes are going to be your digits or phalanges, just like your fingers were. So same term. Your big toe, though, has a special name called a hallux. And the entire foot, so the entire structure here, or the entire landmark, is going to be the pedal. So you pedal a bicycle, so your foot's called the pedal. So again, make sure when you're studying these, you're studying the medical term, which is before the OR or before the OR, and the common term is after the OR. So do not give me the common term, give me the medical term on the practical. Okay, now let's keep going. Now we're going to be looking at the back part of the body. So again, we've done this before. The entire head, which includes the skull and the face, is called cephalic. The neck is called the cervical. All of the back, so all of the back here, would be the dorsal. Okay, and in a minute we're going to cover some more terms within that back, but the entire structure that or the entire landmark that I've circled here is the dorsal. The top of the shoulders is called the acromial. So whether it's the front view or the back view, the top of the shoulder here is called the acromial. The back of the elbow is called olecranon. And the entire arm is called the upper limb. The entire leg is called the lower limb. So if I put a number 1 on the entire arm and say, what is this entire landmark? You would tell me the upper limb. Going down to the lower area here. So as part of the back, these areas in the lower back here and here, I'm circling, those areas of the back are called lumbar. Then again, you can see the entire arm is called the upper limb. The entire leg here is called the lower limb. Then the buttocks or the booty is called the gluteal. The back of the knee is called the popliteal. Remember, the front of the knee is called patellar. Back of the knee is called popliteal. Then going down to the calf is called the sural. So remember, crural was the front, that's your shin. The sural is the back, the calf. Calcaneal, that's the heel of the foot. And plantar is the sole of the foot. So those landmarks that we just covered, that's going to take just a bunch of repetition to get those. If you can find somebody to practice with, maybe print that portion of your study guide out and give someone a copy of it and have them point to the different parts of the body while you tell them the landmark. That's a way of practicing those. Okay, now moving on, we're going to cover the abdominopelvic quadrants. So remember from our landmarks that this area right here was the abdomen or the abdominal, and this area here was the pelvic. So together that makes up the abdominopelvic region of the body. And within that region, we can divide that region into 4 quadrants or 4 spaces. The reason this is important to divide those up is when you come into the ER, for instance, and you're going, oh my gosh, I hurt right here. They're not just going, oh, she's got some pain somewhere on her trunk. No, they're going to divide it into smaller regions so they can pinpoint where the problem may be. And the way they do that is they'll say, oh, she has pain, for instance, in her right lower quadrant. Well, that points to the fact that that could be appendicitis. Okay. Or they're going to point, oh, she has pain over there in her left upper quadrant. Okay, well, that may be the stomach, or it may be the spleen, or it may even be part of the gallbladder. So it's very important that they know where in the abdominopelvic region that you're having the issue. So in these, the top 2 are upper quadrants and the lower 2 are lower quadrants. And then you have right and left. But remember this, when you're looking at your patient, you're using their right and left, not your right and left. Okay. So when you're looking at the patient, your right is their left. That is a major problem with students in A&P is they keep wanting to use your own right and left and not your patient's right and left. Okay. So remember they're opposite when you're looking at them. So be able to label these abdominopelvic quadrants. So quad means 4, so it's divided into 4 areas. Number 1 would be the right upper quadrant. Number 2 would be the left, excuse me, upper quadrant. Number 3 would be the right lower quadrant. And number 4 would be the left lower quadrant. And you have to put the entire word. Do not put RUQ, put right upper quadrant. Okay, we've divided that in 4, but now you can actually divide the abdominopelvic region into 9s. Okay, so let's review these. So now we're going to be talking about the abdominopelvic regions. Again, you can divide it into 4 and you get the quadrants, but then you can divide it down further into regions. And you need to also know these regions for your practical. So let's start in these. So let's take the right and left hypochondriac region. Hypo means below, and chondria refers to cartilages. So what it's talking about here is the right and the left hypochondriac regions are the regions below the cartilages in the ribs. Okay. So again, hypo means below and chondria means the cartilage, and it's talking about the cartilages involved with the ribs. So right and left hypochondriac regions are there. In between those right and left hypochondriac regions, this is called the epigastric region. This is going to be where your stomach is. Epi means sitting upon, and gastric refers to the stomach. So this center block here in the top is your epigastric region. Below your epigastric, if you're going down, this is going to be the region that's going to have your belly button. So this area is going to be called your umbilical region. And then below the umbilical will be your hypogastric. It's called hypogastric because it's sitting below the gastric or below the stomach area. Then going out from your umbilical, if you remembered in our landmarks, if you're looking from the back, this area right here, oops, my circle there got a little bit wild. Let me redo that circle. the lower back on both sides is called the lumbar region. So you'll see where these two circles are. That would be your lumbar region of the back. So you have the right lumbar region and the left lumbar region. Then going down, I'll circle this next area in red. This area here and here is called your left and right iliac region, or it can be called your left and right inguinal. So remember we said those diagonal lines where the lower limb comes in? Oh, Lordy, my spelling here with this little pen is horrible. Inguinal, okay? So the left and right iliac can also be called the right and left inguinal region. Iliac is the bone that's found in there, the part of the hip bone, but that landmark is called inguinal. I do not mind whether you call it the right and left iliac or the right and left inguinal. Being you're already memorizing inguinal, I would think that would make it easier, but again, I do not care which one you use, both are equally correct. Okay. Now you can cut the body into different planes, and you can cut organs into different planes. So those planes are called sectional planes. In other words, it's where we cut something. So the first one we're going to review here is the frontal plane. So the frontal plane is going to be dividing the front from the back. So you can see this, I'm going to put a little number 1 on here, number 1. You can see this plane cuts the front of the body from the back of the body. Then you have transverse, number 2. The transverse, I'm going to label this cut over here. Transverse is going to cut the left side. Sorry, I messed that one up. Sorry about that. The transverse, let me erase. I labeled it on the wrong one. The transverse is going to cut top from bottom. So let's do number 2 here. The transverse is going to be cutting top to bottom. So you can see number 2 over there to the right hand side, you're cutting the top part of the body separate from the bottom part of the body. Then number 3 is the sagittal. The sagittal is going to cut left from right or side to side. If you think sagittal starts with an S, side and side starts with an S. So left side from right side, that cut is going to be called a sagittal plane. You have a special sagittal plane that cuts the body or an organ into exact mirror images. So it's going to cut it right down the middle. And that's what you're actually seeing here in number 3. That's called a mid-sagittal plane. Okay. So if I cut, for instance, down right here, that's going to cut left from right, but it's not going to be mirror images because this side here that I'm just drawing the squiggly on, this side does not have part of your nose, doesn't have any eye. So that would be a sagittal cut, but it wouldn't be a mid-sagittal cut. Number 3 that's labeled there would be a mid-sagittal cut because it cuts the body into 2 mirror images, left side from right side. Then we have another one that is not listed here, but you do have to know. So if I take my pen again, and I cut something at a diagonal cut, that's called oblique, O-B-L-I-Q-U-E, oblique. So that is an oblique sectional plane. So oblique is cutting it at a diagonal line. Body cavities, you have several body cavities you need to know. Cavity is just a space. So the first body cavity we're going to cover is cranial cavity. So the cranial cavity is going to be up here in the cranium or in the head, where I'm drawing the red circle. That's where your brain is going to go. So that's called your cranial cavity. The next cavity we're going to talk about is the thoracic cavity. So the thoracic cavity here is going to be in that entire chest area. But within the thoracic cavity, you have the pleural cavity, which is going to surround the lungs, and the pericardial cavity, which is going to surround the heart. Okay, so again, the thoracic cavity would be all of this cavity right here that I'm circling in orange. All of that cavity would be the thoracic, but within that thoracic, you have this blue here that is going to be the pleural cavity. And then you have this pink here, which is going to be pericardial cavity. The pleural cavity would be housing the lungs, and the pericardial cavity would be housing the heart. Then you have a muscle that separates the pleural from the the thoracic from the lower cavities. This right here is your diaphragm. That's the muscle that sits below the lungs that helps you breathe. Okay, and you do have to know that structure called the diaphragm. Sitting under the diaphragm, all of these two cavities together, so I'm going to circle them both, all of those two cavities together is called your abdominopelvic cavity. Okay, it's going to have your abdominal cavity plus your pelvic cavity. So if I had on a practical, what is this entire cavity marked number 1? That entire cavity would be the abdominopelvic cavity. Within that cavity, you have the top cavity, which is going to have your digestive organs in it. That's going to be called your abdominal cavity. And then this bottom cavity here is going to be the pelvic cavity. It will have your urinary and reproductive organs. So make sure you go through and you memorize these cavities. Okay, now if we cut the top of the body off from the bottom of the body and we're looking down into the thoracic, which is your chest cavity, this is what we're seeing. So let me get my pen again. So here is a rib that I'm highlighting in red. Here is a rib, and this is your spine. So this would be the front, called the anterior right here, and the back here would be the posterior side. You're seeing the right lung here and the left lung here. And then right here, I'm drawing an H, that would be your heart. Okay. So this sac right here around the heart would be your pericardial sac. And this sac here, right around the lung, would be your pleural cavity. Then you have a wad of tissue seen here in yellow. That wad of tissue is called your mediastinum. Your mediastinum is going to keep the heart and the lungs positioned correctly in the thoracic cavity. So in this picture, make sure you can also identify the pleural cavity, the pericardial cavity, and the mediastinum. Organ systems. There are several organ systems in the body. The integumentary system, this is the organ system that is going to be composed of the skin, the hair, the sweat glands, and the nails. The skeletal system, this is going to be comprised of your bones, your cartilages, some ligaments, and your bone marrow. Then you have your muscular organ system, and it's going to be composed of the muscles and the tendons. Then you have your nervous system of the body. It's comprised of the brain, the spinal cord, your peripheral nerves, and your sense organs, such as the eyes, the ears, things like that. Then you have your endocrine system. Your endocrine system is going to be comprised of your different glands. So your pituitary gland, your thyroid gland, your pancreas, your adrenal glands. It's also going to be comprised of the gonads, which are your sexual glands in the body, and other endocrine tissues. Then you have your cardiovascular, which is also called your circulatory system. It's comprised of the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels. Then going down to the next page, you have the last of your organ systems listed here. You have your lymphatic system. Your lymphatic system is comprised of your spleen, your thymus, your lymphatic vessels, your lymph nodes, and your tonsils. The respiratory system is comprised of your nasal cavities, your sinuses, your larynx, which is your voice box, your trachea, which is your wind tube, your bronchi, your lungs, and your alveoli. Your digestive system is comprised of your teeth, tongue, pharynx, which is your throat, your esophagus, which is your food tube, your stomach, your small intestines, large intestines, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Then your urinary system is comprised of your kidneys, your ureters, which are tubes that lead out of the kidneys, your urinary bladder, and your urethra, which is a tube that leads out of the bladder. Your male reproductive is comprised of testes, your epididymis, your ductus deferens, seminal vesicles, prostate gland, penis, and scrotum. Then you have your female reproductive system, which is comprised of the ovaries, the uterine tubes, the uterus, the vagina, the labia, the clitoris, and the mammary glands. So for the lab, you need to be able to identify these pictures as which organ system. So for instance, if I put this picture right here on the practical and said identify this organ system, you would tell me endocrine. If I put the picture that looks like this on there and say identify this organ system, you would tell me integumentary. Another type of question I can ask you is to list 2 organs from this organ system. So if I asked you to list 2 organs from number 1 organ system right here, you could tell me any of these below: brain, spinal cord, peripheral nerves, or sense organs, but you'd have to list 2 of them. Okay. And we're going to stop part 3 right there, and part 4 will pick up at cell anatomy.